We are now learning the Trump administration plans to release the crew of the oil tanker seized off the coast of Venezuela. We are told that that ship is being brought to Texas. An elite Coast Guard team boarded the tanker and took control of it on Wednesday as tensions escalate with Venezuela. The Justice Department claiming it was being used to transport sanctioned oil from Venezuela and Iran.
Thank you very much. It's been an interesting day from the standpoint of news. As you probably know, we've just seized a tanker on the coast of Venezuela, a large tanker, very large. Largest one ever seized, actually. And other things are happening, so you'll be seeing that later, and you'll be talking about that later with some other people.
A Venezuelan oil tanker is seized near Venezuela's waters, and suddenly the real issue isn't only about oil. It's about who gets to control the arteries of global trade. Iran calls the seizure state-sponsored piracy. Washington calls it sanctions enforcement. Russia talks about sovereignty. China calls it illegal, long-arm jurisdiction. And for countries watching from the global south, the message feels familiar. The rules are flexible for the powerful, rigid for everyone else. According to multiple reports, U.S. authorities moved to seize the vessel in the coast of Venezuela as part of an intensified pressure campaign against President Nicolas Maduro. This sits inside a longer story that began years ago, when oil sanctions on Venezuela reshaped how Venezuelan crude could reach international markets. When sanctions choke normal routes, banking, insurance, shipping services, trade rarely stops. It mutates. Cargo moves through longer routes, through middlemen, through higher-risk channels, with higher costs attached at every step. And those costs don't fall from the sky. They land on prices, wages, public services, and the daily survival of ordinary people. That's the first trade economics point. Sanctions are not just policy statements. They are a form of power over trade infrastructure. They don't only target a government, they target logistics, ports, insurers, registries, payment rails, correspondent banks, spare parts, fueling and maintenance chains, tracking systems, the invisible plumbing that makes global commerce work. When that plumbing is controlled by one block, law can start to look like leverage. Iran's response was immediate and deliberately blunt. Iranian officials framed the seizure as illegal and argued it has no valid foundation in international law. Tehran's language wasn't neutral, and it wasn't meant to be. Iran used terms like piracy and armed robbery at sea, casting the act as a crime rather than an administrative enforcement action. The argument was simple. When a government uses force against another country's commercial vessel, whether in international waters or close to a national coastline, it violates international norms and threatens the basic idea that the oceans are routes for commerce, not arenas for selective punishment. Washington rejects the piracy framing and presents the move as enforcement under U.S. sanctions authorities. But the gap between those two narratives is the point. One side is speaking in the language of domestic law. The other is speaking in the language of international legitimacy. And when these collide, smaller states learn the same lesson again. Your sovereignty exists on paper, but your trade exists inside a system someone else can switch off. Iran also framed this incident as part of a broader pattern. In Tehran's view, the United States uses military reach and financial dominance to impose its will on states that refuse American demands. Venezuela is the latest stage, but Iran insists it has lived this story for decades. That framing is designed to pull other countries into the argument. If this can happen to Venezuela today, who is safe tomorrow? And if the global community claims to be committed to stopping piracy, why would that commitment suddenly weaken when the actor is a major power rather than a criminal gang? This is where the double standard accusation bites. The world invests heavily in fighting piracy because piracy threatens commerce and stability. Navies patrol shipping lanes, courts prosecute maritime criminals, governments coordinate to protect trade routes because they understand something basic. Global trade cannot function under fear. Iran's claim is that the world treats piracy as a serious crime when it's carried out by non-state actors, but becomes cautious and selective when a state uses armed power to seize a vessel for political ends. Critics of U.S. sanctions policy make a similar argument. Coercion is being repackaged as rules, and the label depends on who holds the leverage. From the TradEconomics lens, the most important impact isn't the press conference language. It's how the seizure changes behavior in the market. The moment commercial shipping senses that vessels can be taken, risk premiums rise. Insurers price in danger. Ship owners reroute. Buyers demand discounts. Banks delay transactions. Freight becomes more expensive. Even without a single shot fired, trade starts to behave like it's under threat. That's how economic warfare works. You don't need to blockade every ship. You only need to make enough people believe their cargo could be next. Iran extended its criticism to Europe as well, accusing some European governments of staying quiet or reacting timidly. In Tehran's framing, Europe lacks independence when it comes to confronting American actions, even when those actions appear to clash with international norms. Whether one agrees or not, the accusation reveals something real about the global economic order. There are hierarchies of voice. Some states can act first and explain later. Others must seek permission before they even complain. Then Russia entered the picture. After the seizure, the Kremlin confirmed that President Vladimir Putin spoke by phone with President Nicolas Maduro. Reports described Putin reaffirming support for Venezuela's sovereignty and framing the relationship around strategic partnership. The timing mattered. Coming right after the seizure, the call was widely read as a signal. If Washington escalates pressure on Caracas, Moscow will answer with visible support. This wasn't framed as routine diplomacy. It was framed as counter-pressure. For Russia, Venezuela represents more than sympathy. It represents leverage, geography, and symbolism, a foothold in a region Washington has long treated as its sphere of influence. Every step of U.S. pressure on Venezuela becomes, for Moscow, an opportunity to challenge the idea that one power alone can decide what happens in the Western Hemisphere. Supporting Caracas is also a way for Russia to project the message that allies under pressure will not be left isolated. Reports also described Russia and Venezuela discussing accelerated economic and energy cooperation under an existing strategic partnership framework. The practical meaning of such cooperation is straightforward. When Western markets are restricted by sanctions, alternatives become political lifelines. Russian companies can provide services Western firms avoid. Russian financial channels can process transactions that U.S. sanctions try to block. Russian markets can absorb exports that face barriers elsewhere. Whether the scale is sufficient is a separate question, but the logic is clear. Sanctions create demand for alternative trade routes, and geopolitics creates the suppliers. For Russia, the benefits run in the other direction as well. Venezuela offers access to vast reserves, a strategic position in the Caribbean, and a partner willing to align against U.S. pressure. Beyond bilateral ties, coordination in energy markets can also be used to blunt the economic effects of sanctions and to protect state revenues. The bigger point isn't that Russia can magically solve Venezuela's constraints. The bigger point is that sanctions pressure encourages the targeted state to deepen ties with Washington's rivals, accelerating the very multipolar alignment the United States says it wants to prevent. Russian officials also emphasized a familiar word: sovereignty. In their framing, Venezuela is a sovereign state, and everything happening around Venezuela should occur in accordance with international law. That statement is not just legal language, it's a direct challenge to Washington's posture. It implies that the seizure risks violating international norms and that U.S. actions are not automatically legitimate simply because the U.S. says they are. Sovereignty, in this context, has a specific meaning. It means Venezuela has the right to choose its own government without outside interference. It means Venezuela has the right to choose its partners, including Russia and China. And it means no external power has the right to dictate Venezuela's economic future by force. Whether one agrees with Russia's intentions or not, The framing is designed to resonate widely, especially in regions with long memories of intervention and extraction. China then added its own criticism. Beijing's message focused less on moral language and more on the structure of global trade. China opposed what it described as illegal unilateral sanctions and extraterritorial long-arm jurisdiction that lacks a basis in international law and is not authorized by the UN Security Council. The point China was making is fundamental to international commerce. Trade cannot function when one state extends its domestic law across borders and enforces it globally through financial and military dominance. In China's framing, the seizure wasn't neutral law enforcement, it was unilateral coercion. It was a superpower acting as judge, jury, and executor without an international mandate. And China's concern goes beyond Venezuela. Beijing has faced growing U.S. restrictions of its own, technology controls, tariffs, sanctions on firms, and pressure on supply chain relationships. So China reads the Venezuela tanker incident as a case study of willingness. If the U.S. can do this to Venezuela using its own rules, the same logic can be turned on others when politics demands it. This is where the story connects directly to international trade and economics. If seizures based on unilateral sanctions become normalized, the entire trading system becomes hostage to political decisions. Companies doing legitimate business can find themselves abruptly exposed. Partners can be cut off without warning. Shipping lanes become contested through legal claims rather than open war. And supply chains that took decades to build can be disrupted overnight. Not because goods can't move, but because moving them becomes too risky. Meanwhile, reports have described increased U.S. military presence in waters near Venezuela, including significant naval assets deployed in the region. Washington describes its posture in terms of sanctions enforcement and security, including operations that U.S. officials say target trafficking networks. The Maduro government denies such accusations and argues they are fabricated. Whatever one believes, the pattern is visible. Economic pressure paired with military signaling, sanctions plus force posture, a tightening ring that aims to restrict revenue, deter trade partners, and isolate the target. And that leads to the core economic reality for Venezuela. Oil accounts for the overwhelming share of export earnings. When oil revenue is squeezed, the ability to import essentials declines, the ability to pay workers deteriorates, and public services weaken. In that environment, sanctions do not simply punish a government. They reshape the social and economic landscape in ways that can entrench hardship, drive migration, and destabilize regions. This is why many countries in the global south treat sanctions with suspicion. They have seen how often populations absorb the damage while elites find workarounds. At this point, 3 major powers have responded in 3 different languages, but with one shared message. Iran frames the seizure as piracy and calls for accountability. Russia frames it as an attack on sovereignty and answers with strategic alignment. China frames it as systemic risk to global trade rules and supply chain stability. Together, they represent a significant share of global economic and military weight, and their coordinated criticism signals that Washington cannot act without generating pushback, even in a region it has long treated as its domain. For Venezuela, this alignment offers political cover and alternative economic pathways. As long as Russia, China, and Iran maintain engagement, Washington's ability to force a decisive outcome is constrained. But the extent of support in practice remains uncertain. Political statements are one thing. Large-scale financial and logistical replacement for Western-dominated trade systems is another. Still, even partial alternatives matter, because they weaken the isolation strategy and signal that targeted states are not alone. This is also why the Caribbean becomes a contested space in this story. It is not only a geographical region, it is a symbolic arena where the old assumption of unchallenged dominance is being tested. U.S. naval forces can operate there, but the diplomatic and economic engagement of Russia and China in Venezuela means those actions no longer happen without public resistance. Supporters of a multipolar world argue that this is evidence of a shifting balance. Critics argue it is a dangerous escalation. Either way, the region is becoming a stage for a larger struggle over who defines legality, who controls trade routes, and who gets to enforce rules beyond their borders. Now, step back and consider the larger question TradEconomics exists to ask. Can any state, especially a smaller or sanctioned state, conduct independent foreign and economic policy if a dominant power can seize commercial assets and intimidate the logistics system that underpins trade? If enforcement is unilateral, then sovereignty becomes conditional. It becomes something you have only as long as you don't cross the preferences of the actor who controls the system. This is why the phrase rules-based order has become so contested. Many Western governments invoke it as a guarantee of stability. But many outside the West experience it as selective, rules applied strictly to the weak and flexibly to the powerful. When Washington breaks the perceived rules, consequences appear limited. When others are accused of breaking rules, Washington leads coalitions to punish them. That perception may be disputed, but it is widespread, and it shapes how states hedge, align, and seek alternatives. What happens next will likely be determined by three things. First, whether enforcement escalates through additional seizures, broader sanctions, or intensified military posture. Second, whether alternative payment routes, logistics channels, and trade partnerships expand in a way that reduces vulnerability to unilateral pressure. Third, whether diplomatic channels open to reduce tension, because coercion often ends not with victory at sea, but with negotiation once costs rise and uncertainty spreads. In the end, this story isn't just about one tanker. It's about the power to flip global trade on and off. It's about what happens when sanctions move from paperwork into physical seizure, and when the ocean becomes a courtroom where the strongest actor tries to write the verdict first. But it's also about resistance, public, coordinated, and framed through law, sovereignty, and supply chains. Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing are signaling that unilateral control will be contested, and that targeted nations increasingly believe they have options, partners, and alternative routes. For supporters of a multipolar world, this looks like evidence that uncontested hegemony is fading. For Washington, it looks like an emerging challenge: adapt to a world that resists unilateral enforcement, or continue pushing into a standoff where economic tools and military signals collide. Either way, the costs of uncertainty are rising, and in the global economy, uncertainty is never free. It is paid in risk premiums, disrupted supply chains, discounted exports, and the everyday lives of people whose countries sit on wealth yet remain poor because power still decides the terms of trade. What do you make of this shift? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.